And you were live.
Good morning, everyone. It's the one, the only, the Senor Silverback, the Gorilla and the Economist, coming to you live on another edition of the Sirius Report with none other than the man, the myth, the legend, London Paul, who needs no introduction anymore, because if you haven't been following Paul, if you haven't become a premium subscriber, you need to do that. You want the hard-hitting intel given daily on what's going on geopolitically, giving you some sort of sense of balance and understanding of the real players that are behind the scenes. You need to subscribe to the Sirius Report. It's imperative. It's a part of our daily repertoire here at Rogue Money. I recommend you guys do the same. With that being said, London Paul, how are you, buddy? How's it going?
I'm very well, and good morning to everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, and thanks for the introduction. It's very kind of you.
Hey, no worries. You got to give credit to where credit's due. You do a phenomenal work, Paul.
Thank you.
Where do we begin? I mean, there's so many things going on. I think the Berkeley riots I don't know if they wrapped up and they're finished or they're still continuing, but I mean, where do we begin, Paul?
Well, I think I kind of went through a few things, and it's always a question of kind of trying to, without using the cliche, joining in the dots. But if we look at Trump, he attempted, obviously, at the outset of his presidency to keep all his pre-election promises. And some he's been able to do, like obviously, to do with TPP, but then he's now finding there are obstacles kind of inside and outside government. Now, the interesting thing is, from my perspective, I think this is just reinforcing his popularity and extending it, because people have got that, they see the establishment as the focal point of why his policies are being thwarted. And the immigration ban's a kind of interesting story. A lot happened in a couple of days. I mean, obviously on Friday, the federal court in the state of Washington, they obviously temporarily suspended the immigration ban. And then I think it was the Department of Justice filed an emergency motion to reverse the court ruling. And then the very aptly named U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, that's an incredible name, they denied the appeal. Now, obviously, after they denied the appeal, obviously the Department of Justice request to restore Donald Trump's suspension order. Obviously, Trump went, well, we're going to still do very thorough checks even when this temporary injunction's in place. Well, now we're here today that obviously there's going to be some series of legal hurdles, and obviously the administration has a deadline to justify the executive order, which obviously is now temporarily barring entry of people from 7 countries. Now, obviously, uncertainty caused by this judge's ban has opened the window, obviously, for people to come in the country, which is obviously something that Trump's referring to, and why he said, we're going to be very thorough on checking people. But apparently, obviously, this Court of Appeal has said that they'll consider a request after receiving more information. And by all accounts, the deadline is, I think, 8 might be, well, it's, I don't know, 3 p.m. apparently Pacific time. So work that out wherever you are in the US. To submit these additional legal documents to justify the executive order. And then apparently following that, if they're in agreement, then the case has to go to the US Supreme Court. So that will get kind of interesting. But I mean, obviously there's people very hostile to this for sure, and the people who are very supportive of it. But because people are seeing the hurdles that he's having to go through, is really making it very difficult for him to pursue this policy, whether it's, regarded as being controversial or otherwise. But people are saying, well, hang on, he's trying to do this and he's having a lot of hurdles to jump through, and it's actually garnering him more support. And of course, the actions of people who are against it are just damaging their credibility and damaging the credibility of anyone protesting because of the way they're going about doing these protests.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing also is, Paul, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you fine.
Oh, sorry, I thought I lost audio again. No, you're absolutely right, man. I mean, people are the American public. Every single poll that's been out where people were polled, they are largely for this ban. They see the atrocities in Europe, and again, the mainstream media is no longer controlling the narratives. A simple individual, all they have to do is just pop on YouTube, and you're seeing the swarm of migrants coming out of North Africa and the Middle East, absolutely defacing and changing the entire face of Europe. Is something that's undeniable. So that is something that the American public does not want here. And of course, Trump is being fought on every level by these globalists, Paul. It's unreal.
Well, yes, and of course, he's having to jump through all the various regulatory and legal hurdles. And now we're at the point where today, okay, mate, we'll see what happens when they submit this additional information. But I think it's also, it kind of comes into the fact of, we heard all about the big thing pre-election about the Obamacare, and obviously they're now realizing, well, hang on. I mean, the proposal, I think, when he signed the executive order was that individual US states have a choice. You can keep Obamacare, or you can provide alternative coverage whilst receiving subsidies from the federal government. Now, they've come out and obviously realized, hang on, this is a huge problem. It wasn't a question of having to just jot a few notes down and throw out Obamacare and introduce a new healthcare plan. And by all accounts, it's going to take around 12 months, possibly, to bring it into fruition. Now, interestingly, people seem to be quite tolerant of this because he's still acting on his election promise that he wants to obviously repeal it and replace it. But now there's a realization, well, actually, it's going to take a lot longer to do, but people seem to be very tolerant of the fact he's doing this. And I think this is kind of symptomatic of what we're going to see going forward with the Trump administration in terms of their capability to be able to say to people, well, look, we're doing what we said we're going to do. We're not going to do it in 5 minutes because obviously it's going to take longer. But there is a learning curve as well for Trump as well. He's going to have to realize it's not like when he conducted business, he's going to have to jump through a lot more hoops. But I think the good thing, of course, is now it's all being played out in public and people are seeing the kind of hoops that previous administration, whatever they were trying to do, would have to jump through or not jump through. And people will be saying, well, hang on, why does Trump have to go to all these lengths when if the Obama administration had brought in this immigration order, you can guarantee there would be no opposition. So it's interesting that people who are not necessarily pro-Trump, may even be anti-Trump, are starting to see things quite differently. And you mentioned Berkeley, and it's kind of interesting. Obviously, we know there was a lot of riots there. There's a lot of talk that there's Soros money behind these demonstrations. There are also suggestions that the UC faculty members have kind of almost justified the riots, which is unbelievable. Well, what was Trump's response? Well, if you're not going to allow free speech and practices, but you're going to impose violence on innocent people who have a different point of view, well, maybe we'll cut your federal funding off. Right. I mean, this is unprecedented kind of response to these problems because he knows full well, that you're going to have some people who are demonstrating. It happened, in my student days, people demonstrated, but not like it is now. And of course, they're seeing the reality of what's going on. And Trump's view is, well, if you're going to adopt this attitude, and particularly if there are faculty members involved, they're going to say, well, hang on, we're not going to tolerate this. So if we cut your federal funds, what's that going to do to you as a university? So it's a different strategy, and we're going to see this more and more where he'll drop these lines. I mean, he made those comments in Twitter, and people say, well, is he serious? What's his intention? But it's going to give food for thought in future when these demonstrations happen and where they happen as to whether that's an appropriate way to deal with it rather than allowing it to get completely out of hand. I mean, there was something, I don't know, it may not seem a lot of money, but there was probably $100,000 of damage as well as intimidation and everything else going on a student campus. It's quite absurd.
I agree. I mean, the funny thing also is that George Soros, one of his sons, actually goes and is doing this PhD thesis over there in Berkeley. And supposedly some of the intel is that Project Veritas has on audio and video certain members of this organization that's causing this rioting and causing this fomentation of violence in the Berkeley campus. They were caught on video and audio describing their plans in detail of what they're about to do. And then the other thing also, Paul, is the fact that, it was also uncovered, I think Breitbart broke the news that they found out that some of the organizers of this riot, and let's call it for what it is a riot, were given $50,000 by none other than Georgi Schwartz, a.k.a. George Soros.
Well, there's certain connections which would lead us to that viewpoint. And we have to be a little bit careful in terms of blaming Soros for everything, but it does have his kind of fingerprints all over it.
Yeah, absolutely right.
But I also was looking that's because there's been a lot of developments lately with Saudi and Iran, and Yemen, and what's going on in terms from a US perspective. So I kind of tried to take a sideways step and think, well, obviously, we know the US policy, it's going to be the end of globalization as the cabal knew it. And Trump wants to recalibrate the US, but he's going to have some major problems. So I started to think, okay, what are the major problems? Who's he going to have to keep happy in the world? Well, the biggest risks is if there's a massive US Treasury sell-off, particularly by China, but also by Saudi Arabia. So arguably at the moment, whatever they feel, they're going to have to keep them on side. They also have to keep Russia on side because China and Russia are joined at the hip in every respect, as we know.
Right.
Now, there's a lot of analysts who are trying to say, well, how is Trump going to, revitalize the US economy? How is he going to finance this and fund it? Well, there's a lot of talk, well, it's going to be by, bondholders in Europe and Japan. I'm not necessarily agreeing with this, but if there is any truth in that, the feeling obviously then is, well, he's going to have to keep Japan and Europe happy. He's going to have to keep China and Saudi Arabia happy. Otherwise, the former could just pull the plug so he can't finance his vision. And obviously, in terms of China and Saudi Arabia, they could, dump US treasuries and effectively hold the US hostage in that regard. So then I thought, okay, well, if any of this is true, let's apply it to what's going on globally. Now, obviously, in terms of Saudi and Yemen, we know the US has been supporting the Saudis indirectly, and we know effectively, arguably, it's a proxy war between obviously Saudi Arabia and Iran in reality. Now, what we're starting to see is the Yemenis are beginning to take the fight to Saudi. There was a terrorist attack where they hit a warship, and there's missiles that they're firing that are landing now inside Saudi, and there's reports apparently one traveled over 1,000 kilometers and landed in Riyadh. Now, it's kind of interesting that there's been a lot of rhetoric coming out regarding Iran, and we can talk about that now with respect to this, where obviously they've got these recent sanctions, and to be honest, they're rather meaningless and tokenism. And there's talk of further sanctions, but from my respect, it's a complete own goal. I mean, the ballistic missile test Iran conducted recently doesn't defy the conditions of the nuclear treaty signed a year ago.
Right, okay.
And Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, has pretty much said as much without being explicit when he said there was no need for the US to realign its military capability in the Middle East. But then on the flip side, you had Flynn, who's, anyone who doesn't know, is the National Security Advisor, and he came out with all guns blazing, saying, Iran was being put on notice. So there seems to be a split in the ranks. But it would be foolish, from my perspective, for the US to lock horns with Iran, because they're heavily supported by Russia and China. Right. The former obviously economically and militarily, and obviously the latter economically. And also, what can Iran do to the oil markets? They can flood the market with very cheap oil. I mean, they produce oil at $10 a barrel or less at one time. Some of it was $4 a barrel by all accounts.
Wow, and that's even lower than the Saudis.
Yeah, I mean, China sees obviously Iran as an integral part of the new Silk Road, and it's kind of interesting. Tehran said, well, if you're going to put a blacklist of Iranian individuals and entities, we're going to create one as well, because we believe they've been backing Al Qaeda and whatever else. But the newly imposed US sanctions, of course, on Iran don't affect Iran's cooperation with Asia or Europe, because they're not taking part in this. Now, the question is, why are they having such a go at Iran? Well, it all ties in, obviously, to do with Saudi, because Saudi and Iran, as we know historically, are not great allies by any stretch of the imagination. And I think a lot of this is just hot air and rhetoric, but it's to appease the Saudis. And why? Because at the moment, they're not in a position to upset the Saudis, because the Saudis might go, well, we'll just dump all our treasuries. I mean, Saudi's economy is in tatters, and the House of Saud's teetering on the edge. But it's very much, I think, a tit for tat. And this is why we're seeing these very strange comments. And I thought at the time, well, why are they bothering to do this? Attacking Iran the way they are is rather pointless. But I think it's largely to appease the Saudis.
Yeah, that makes sense. What do you think about the theory that Trump is trying to crash the system in order to usher in that global economic reset, because the wealth is still in the hands, even though it's all paper wealth, it's still in the hands of the Western elitists. What do you think about that theory, Paul?
Well, I mean, let's look at this kind of, from my perspective, quite logically. There is no doubt, we've said this before, Trump will look at a particular aspect of the government, or whatever other aspect of the administration, and say, look, you're not really one for trying to fix things that are more than slightly broken. So yeah, he'll just throw them in the bin and say, okay, let's start again. There's always the risk if he says, well, okay, let's take the financial system down. Now, we know the financial system is going to be reset. That is irrefutable. He knows what's coming. He knows the US dollars is, as a reserve currency, is dead. He knows the gold standard's coming back. Right. Hence why they're going to do a gold audit, et cetera, et cetera. So He's fully aware of the circumstances. I don't actually see him personally saying, okay, let's just trash the entire system. But however, the risk, of course, is, for example, let's say they audit the Fed properly. You and I know that that's an enormous can of worms that's going to, and if that blows, then it's going to create major, major problems, not just inside the US, but globally. I mean, what's the effect it's going to have on central banks around the world, the confidence in the dollar, and the list goes on. So it's enormous. So there is ramifications for the actions he's taken, but I don't think he's actually going to sit there and say, well, we'll just take everything down. The risk, of course, is the blowback could be enormous, and it's something you can't really control if you do that. But ultimately, of course, the entire financial system's bust. We all know that in the West, particularly, including all the banks. So, but I don't actually think he's strategically sitting there going, let's take the whole financial system down. But sure, there's a wrecking ball, and I mentioned this, where they will take it to everything. And yeah, of course, in the process, they may cause some serious collateral damage. And we're already seeing, people say his attitude was about the immigration ban. Well, yes, there is collateral damage. There are going to be quite a lot of innocent people who won't get in easily, but tough, because there's a bigger agenda here and there's a bigger problem. So I think that's his rationale, which you can apply across everything. But yeah, no, I don't think he's actually seriously sitting there going, well, if you want to take the financial system down, it's very easy to do it. But of course, the risk is in doing that, he may be remembered as the president who took the financial system down and not a lot else. So he can't be really seen to do that, but he's playing a very clever, cagey game and sizing up what's going on internally and globally. And that's why I think he knows the House of Sound's dead, for example. He knows it's finished, but he'll just play along with them as long as he needs to play along with them in order to ensure that they don't rock the boat too much now. So therefore, that doesn't imply to me that he's going to, the wrecking ball's there, but not in the context of just raising everything to the ground. And I think a classic example of in terms of foreign policy is to do with Syria. Now, Trump scrapped US plans for liberating Raqqa. Now, when you look at what the Obama administration was planning to do, he was going to use Syrian Kurds as their allies in what they said was the liberation. And incredibly enough, they were going to arm them with Russian-made machine guns and mine-clearing equipment. It's incredible that the US were going to do that. But this clearly was a huge diplomatic minefield in itself, given that Turkey views the Kurdish fighters as their #1 enemy and terrorists. Now, in the original plan, there was no provision for coordinating operations with Russia and no clear political strategy for addressing the concerns of the Turks. And of course, the other problem is they never had any plan B. And the Trump administration went, hang on, there's no plan B. And they realized there needs to be coordination between Russia and the US and the setting up of some joint center of operational planning, joint airstrikes, and then probably adopt a very similar strategy to how they took Aleppo. Now, at all times in this, he's been sensitive to the needs of Turkey and saying, well, we don't want to upset the Turks. We want them on side. Because so they've got to find a compromise with Turkey, which would be impossible if they maintained the Obama plan, hence why it got thrown out the window. And they said there's no way we're going to implement it because it's completely flawed on every level. So it's this kind of approach where everyone sees him as very gung-ho and in terms of what he's saying, but he's playing a very clever game globally. He doesn't want to upset people. Now, if the idea was we'll just take a wrecking ball to everything and it doesn't matter, who cares? He wouldn't be treading a careful political or geopolitical view of the world. And I think that's something he is doing, which is perhaps people are underestimating a little bit.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the direction that he's taking, especially the strategies that he's working on with, with himself and his own inner cadre, guys like Steve Bannon, I think, yeah, you're right. He is playing a very clever game here because he can't show all his cards at once, right?
No, absolutely. And he has to say, well, that there is a broader perspective. He knows what the end game is. He knows, I think when he talked about 8 years, I think he feels it's going to take 8 years to remedy all the problems. Now, people will get rather frightened and go, what, we've got 8 years of insanity to deal with before we get, to the end? No, it's a long-term plan. It's going to happen over a number of years. You're going to see a lot of move this year and into next year and so on. But it's all part of a strategic change. And you're not going to change a world that's been run by the cabal. I mean, admittedly, more the Western world than anyone. And you change that overnight. It's a long process. As we've talked, I mean, we could talk for weeks about the ramifications of that. And I think there's a realization that to get the US on a really solid economic footing, yeah, in the first year he'll do an awful lot, the second year, third year, but to really turn this huge oil tank around that's been in decline for decades is not going to happen in 5 minutes. And okay, there's the next US election. Sounds crazy we're talking about it, but in 4 years' time, what are we looking at? I mean, it'll be a very different US, and we'll see if the US people are happy with the progress that's being made. But we can't expect instant miracles overnight, and because the policy changes that need to be made are enormous, not just in terms of what you do internally, but the whole apparatus that supports the administration, which we know is still littered with people who are not very Trump sympathetic or sympathetic to changing the US to a nation that supports the people rather than, the chosen few or the Beltway or whatever you want to refer to it. So I think that is a big sea change that is not going to happen overnight for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I agree with that wholeheartedly, man. How's the how are the cabal in London taking all this, all the things that are happening in the U.S., especially in the EU? You have Marine Le Pen just gaining incredible momentum over Francois Fillon. You still have the Ital exit; it's still there. That's building momentum. What's going on in the city of London, Paul? What could you tell us about what they're doing over there?
Okay, well, obviously, let's focus initially on the UK. Obviously, the white paper came out from Brexit, and people say, well, yeah, it's very wishy-washy. It kind of says a few things. I mean, the major points that they say taking control of our own laws, absolutely, because Brussels has basically taken a huge amount of legislation away from nations like the UK. They've mentioned controlling immigration, but didn't exactly say what they meant by that. So that might be a bit of a hot potato in some people's eyes. But rightly, they say they want to secure rights for EU nationals in the UK and UK nationals in the EU. There's a lot of them. So that's important. They want to protect workers' rights because, believe it or not, you have better workers' rights in the UK under UK law than you have under EU law. And they want to ensure free trade with European markets. That's fine. Secure new trade agreements with other countries. And this is what I keep hearing, and I'm hearing this repeatedly, cooperating in the global fight against crime, cybercrime and terrorism. Now, this is obviously, I've talked about this before, that cybercrime is an enormous problem that is being vastly overlooked, particularly in Western nations. They think, well, someone steals a few billion. Yeah, it's annoying, but who cares? Well, it's far greater than that, and we can talk about that a little bit later on. But there's a recognition of global terrorism. Well, we know that the aftermath of the cabal's policy is we're not going to eradicate terrorism from the planet for quite a long time. And even if we have coordinated efforts between Russia, the US, Turkey, Iran, and China, and whoever else in the world, it's going to take a long time. So I think the realization is in the UK, they know Brexit's coming. There's a lot of talk, oh, well, when Brexit happened, oh, the cabal wanted Brexit to happen. Well, no, they didn't. Absolutely not. This was a hammer blow. I mean, it was the first major domino to fall. And in some ways, obviously, the irony is, of course, the Trump domino falling is far greater. But yes, there's a realization. There was a big fear what's going to happen in terms of the banking system. Is a lot of banks going to relocate elsewhere in Europe? I absolutely don't think that's going to happen. I think the bigger fear for the UK's financial system is, I don't talk about this, I have a strange feeling it's going to move outside of London. It may move to the north of England eventually. There's a lot of interesting things going on below the waterline in terms of developments that are happening in this, because in the part of the world, obviously, that I come from as well, in the north of England. So we'll see what happens in that regard. But then, of course, you have the impact of France. I mean, and obviously the latest allegations coming out of France to do with Fillon is that he's embroiled in this graft scandal where apparently his wife did all this work and got paid money, and they're saying she didn't do it. And apparently he's holding a press conference probably now, actually. And many are expecting he's going to step down, and others are suggesting he's going to come out with all guns blazing and fight this, fake job scandal. But we'll see what happens in that regard. But in terms of Le Pen, she's kind of the natural kind of ally to do with Brexit and Trump. She says she wants a free, independent, democratic country, the end of globalization as it is. And she wants this, country for France to have what she terms a local revolution and have intelligent protectionism and economic patriotism. She said the EU was a failure. It kept none of its promises. Absolutely true. And she wants to renegotiate the French's membership fundamentally. And if they refuse, she's going to demand a referendum if she's elected. And if they do have a referendum, I think France will leave. Yeah, she's very tough on immigration, and the recent knife attack in the Louvre just adds fuel to the fire in that regard. So that is a huge melting pot. Now, a lot of people think, well, she might make the first election, but she's not going to get the second, and she won't ultimately even be able to have a chance to stand. But don't write her off, because people wrote Brexit off and wrote Trump off, and exactly the opposite happened.
Yeah.
Then if you look at what's going on in Greece now, I wrote an article on the website about this. I'm not going to go into massive detail about this, but obviously Greece, and you know this as well as I do, for a number of years has been in a situation where every year or two there's another debt crisis. Greece is going to leave the European Union, and then all of a sudden it all gets resolved. Well, I think the attitude and the temperature in Athens has changed massively, because now they have to apparently conduct this compliance of terms attached to a near 100 billion euro aid package, and they also are facing problems with making debt repayments in July, which they can't do. They're not going to be capable of doing. And the creditors are demanding even more austerity. I mean, to put this in context, they've had to reduce their pensions 12 times in the last 6 years.
Oh, that's always a good sign, Paul.
Yeah, it is. They're also demanding that more Greek cuts for the tax-free threshold, so more income tax for people. And this is on the back of the IMF is farcically suggesting it needs to do this to reach a goal of a primary surplus of 3.5% of GDP within 12 months. I mean, this is absolute insanity. It's just not going to happen. And of course, I think, the Greek Parliament is now reaching the point where they're going, look, this is insanity, and it's just not sustainable. I mean, they've kept kicking the can down the road, but I get the feeling Greece may just end up very soon having to walk away. And I think there's a move inside the political establishment certainly to start considering that, and that's what I'm hearing, that internally, Syriza is actually now saying we're going to have to probably think about leaving. Now, Greece leaving the European Union isn't going to be the end of the European Union, but you're absolutely right. When you look at Italy, and Italy's hanging on a knife edge. I mean, Italy will be the nation that will take the European Union down. Greece leaving will cause some earth tremors, but it won't cause the earthquake that brings it down. So no, there's all these melting pots happening in Europe, and I think Brexit was the trigger. I think nations are now going, well, hang on, the UK is leaving. Now, okay, they don't have the euro, but so what? But hang on, we're now starting to see the UK's talking to nations, and they're interested in free trade agreement. We can actually re-stimulate our economy. And they're started now, of course, looking at the Trump model, which is exactly kind of the same of saying, well, we're not going to have this stupid globalization. We're going to have these ridiculous trade agreements as the European Union has. We're going to say, well, I'm the US and I'm going to negotiate individually with nations. It's going to be far more beneficial to both of us. So this snowball effect's having obviously effects now in France. Obviously, there's the issue in Greece and Italy. We're seeing obviously movements to do with the Ukraine, which is hugely important, because obviously we know historically what happened in Ukraine. Now, obviously,
well, you had Tymoshenko. Ilya Tymoshenko was over here recently in the White House begging for money.
Yeah, absolutely. And Poroshenko escalated the violence in Donbass because in his deluded head he thinks the US is going to support it.
He's crazy.
And the thing is, it's time to stop calling it this Ukraine-Russian war. Let's look at it. It's a genuine civil war in which the West has backed the state, namely Poroshenko via the Ukrainian forces. They were in violation in 24 hours of over 500 shellings in 24 hours. It's gone out of control. Sorry, go on.
I'm sorry, that's insane.
Absolutely, and then we're getting told this, and then unlike in Syria, which is not a civil war, where they backed the so-called rebels and is against the state, namely Assad, but that's okay. So the hypocrisy knows no bounds. But Trump's aware of this and all the ramifications. Now, Does Poroshenko seriously imagine the US is going to start locking horns with Russia over that? Absolutely not. They want a way out of it. They want a way out of the mess. So that's another aspect of Europe that's going to have huge ramifications, because the question is, well, does Poroshenko survive? Ultimately, probably not. Now, the question from both the West and the East perspective is who takes over. That is a bit of a worry, because it's fine to get rid of one oligarch and then replacing him with another. Now, there are some fairly Russian sympathetic oligarchs who, not in the sense that they're going to then persecute the Ukrainians, but they're saying, we want an end to this. We want an end to sanctions, because obviously it's destroying Ukraine. And increasingly, Ukraine's been seen as an example across Europe where nations are going, hang on, we've seen what meddling happens. There was an overthrow. Okay, you're telling us lies about the coup, but okay, so there was a coup and this Poroshenko came in, and now you've wrecked their economy. And nations across Europe, and we talked about this previously with other smaller nations, they've been absolutely wrecked. There's simmering problems again in Spain, where they're getting rather. Sorry?
Yeah, Spain and even Portugal, huge issues.
Yeah, there's huge financial issues and problems there, and obviously the Catalonians are now talking again. They want to leave Spain, and ultimately
want to leave.
Yeah, but ultimately, of course, they will do. Yeah. And so there's a simmering pot, but there's a realization and acceptance in the UK that the UK is leaving. I mean, it was a bit like Trump. He won't get elected. Oh, he's been elected. Oh, the Electoral College will stop it. No, this will stop. And it's the same with the UK. Well, the parliamentary vote was resounding, and of course, the UK is now on to invoke Article 50, and then it'll take about 2 years to leave. And of course, the problem from the EU's perspective is they can make this rather easy or difficult for themselves. But if they are intransigent, it just alienates more people and nations inside Europe. If they make it rather easy, then the reverse effect happens, and people go, hang on. Well, they've left the European Union. Look at the benefits for the UK. Right, we want out of it. And of course, you've got the German elections coming up. And I mean, having Scholz or Merkel is like, I said, it's like turkeys voting for Christmas. It doesn't matter. They're both ridiculous to consider voting either, but that's the kind of perverse choice that the Germans have. But I mean, I think Germany's obviously, we know they're kind of rotating east. So the whole of Europe's this gigantic melting pot. And whilst all these analysts go, well, Europe's going to have to finance Trump, Europe's nervously going, well, what's Trump going to do to us? Is he going to just pull NATO out? I mean, how is he going to trade with us in the future? So it's kind of this enormous melting pot in Europe. And ultimately, it's all kind of revolving around what Trump's doing, what the UK is doing, namely Brexit, obviously, and his election. And then, of course, there's on the flip side to all this, we're then seeing what the East's doing. And, there's the whole issue with China and the US. And there was all this idea, all this simmering tensions going on, and all this public kind of persona and rhetoric going on. But behind the scenes, Washington and Beijing are not interested in having an all-out trade war. The US particularly knows if they do, it will destroy them. I mean, China can destroy the US economically overnight.
Yeah.
They just say we've dumped all our treasuries, or we'll tell the world that we really hold 30-odd thousand tons of gold and we're ready to launch a gold-backed yuan. It's game over. The United States have now just said we're reluctant to launch any kind of large-scale military response to Chinese activity in the South China Sea. Well, there's a massive climb down. And behind the scenes, they're playing a few games, testing the water, but the serious dialogue will start about future bilateral relations. And the same came out with Russia. I mean, there was a comment from Nikki Haley who was going, well, we're not going to drop sanctions until Russia leaves, Crimea and returns it to the Ukraine. And then the next breath they're going,
crap. Yeah. What an idiot. I mean, oh, God, what a dumb idiot.
But then in the next breath, she's going, well, we've been sitting down in the UN and we plan to closely cooperate with each other, Russia and the US, and we're working together. It's all just kind of rhetoric. I think it's a bit like I said the week Trump will open the door, everyone walks in, he throws a hand grenade in and sees what's happening. They're still throwing hand grenades here, there, and everywhere and seeing what the response is. Yeah. But they are having to juggle things quite carefully, and it comes back to the whole business. I mean, it's like a few weeks ago, people going, well, what's going on with Israel? He seems to be implicating Netanyahu, and then suddenly out of the blue he goes, we're advising Israel no longer to consider, building any more settlements. And yeah, I'm due to meet him in, Netanyahu in the middle of February, and we'd like them just to hold fire and do nothing until then. And then the whole embassy move was canned as well. So we're seeing this kind of rhetoric on the one hand, and then kind of backing off. But of course, now Netanyahu's jumping on the Iranian bandwagon and going, well, this aggressive posturing nature. What? I didn't know being aggressive meant that you launched a ballistic missile that landed on your own territory. That hardly constitutes aggression. But of course, this is all part of the game as well, because Israel sees Iran as a problem, as does Saudi Arabia. But I think we'll see more and more softening towards Saudi. I think the Iranian thing will rumble on for a while, and then of course, eventually it'll die a death, and we won't hear any more of it. But then of course you go on to Cuba. Now Cuba's an interesting proposition, because whilst the rest of the world have largely said, well, we're not interested in all these sanctions, the US has this embargo. Now there's this review going on to do with the embargo. So I don't expect the Trump administration to tighten sanctions, but the US needs to realize that Russia and China are already developing bilateral relations. I mean, there was talk about Russia, having some military base there. Well, I don't think they're going to have some watered down of the Cuban Missile Crisis again. So that's not going to happen. But the US can say, well, we're not going to, impose any more sanctions, but we may leave them the same. But they need to realize what are they actually doing this for? And it's detrimental to them, because Russia and China can quite happily, and as they already have done for a number of years, move in and develop strong bilateral relation. This is very detrimental to the US, but we'll see what the outcome of this review is. Because, of course, it will largely be very, very interesting if the US kind of reverses policy and says, well, actually, I think we'll do something very, very different in terms of Cuba, and we're not going to adopt the stance we are now. But I think within the Trump administration, and this is no surprise to anyone, okay, he's notionally part of the Republican Party. It was the ticket to get him elected. But you and I know, and probably everybody else who's listening, that he's having to deal with a lot of neocons and the old hawks of yesteryear within that administration. And that makes things very difficult for him to be able to maneuver how exactly he wants to. Now, eventually, of course, a lot of these hawks will be put out to grass, and they'll no longer figure in the Republican Party. But he still has to deal with that, because the risk, of course, is he doesn't want to create an absolute storm within his own political party, which could ultimately derail a lot of what he's trying to do. So he's having to tread eggshells everywhere, whilst actually being quite, gung-ho in terms of the comments he's making. So, because he doesn't want the electorate to think he's disowned them or he's going to backtrack from his promises. But I do think there's a realization, not amongst people who don't support him, as far as they're concerned, it's business as usual, but his supporters are looking at it and going, well, we understand he's having internal problems, and it's reinforcing, as I said, his popularity. And I think as time goes by, aside from, there's always going to be a percentage, it happens in every country. It's like in the UK, you always get a hard core of people who'll vote Conservative or Labour, and then you get this whole mishmash in the middle who'll flip-flop from one side to the other. Now, the hard core is always going to stay Democratic. That's not going to change no matter what happens, but you're going to see more and more people move towards Trump if he does the right things. If he doesn't, then of course he has a huge problem, but we're confident that he will do, but time will tell. And he's done a huge amount in a couple of weeks, and we just have to see week by week. I mean, literally every week we could just talk about what Trump's doing, because there is that much going on. And before we came on Earth, CJ was talking about the Riley interview, where there was a suggestion, Putin's a killer, and he said, well, I mean, he basically deflected it by saying, well, and we're so innocent in this country. Of course, that created an absolute storm inside the US, inside his own political party.
Yeah.
But this is the kind of thing he's not frightened to say things, because of course he's absolutely true. This idea, that Putin's a killer and we're so whiter than white is farcical. But the fact he's gone on and said it, and he's not frightened to dodge these questions, but he knows there's going to be a backlash inside the Republican movement, but he's quite happy to take those risks. So he has to, or at all times, kind of balance up what he's going to say and how he's going to go about it.
Yeah, absolutely, man. And a lot of these guys, they're old Cold War. I mean, these guys are still fighting the Cold War in terms of rhetoric, number one. Number two, they're so myopic in their worldview. They have no understanding that the world is completely changed. You ask most of these pundits, Paul, they still think China's biggest, economic sector is sweatshops. They still think that Russia has no modernization, that they're still going through some sort of economic depression. They have no clue. This is the worldview these idiots have, Paul. It's laughable, man. It really is.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's worth talking about the Chinese economy because China always has these 5 and 10-year plans, and they've just recently come out and said they're going to create over 50 million new urban jobs in the next 3 years. Now, wow. China's going to support sectors that create lots of jobs and promote entrepreneurship. That's a big thing for them now. And what they're going to do is they've said, look, we've got an overcapacity. So they had an overcapacity drive, which of course made people redundant. So what did they do? They said, we're going to help college graduates, workers, farmers, and to secure other jobs. We realized we're not just going to do like the West does. Well, we'll just make all this sector redundant and we don't care whether you get another job. They place great stall and focus on finding people alternative jobs, and the plan also stresses the importance of improving the efficiency of human resource and enhancing workers' skills and overall quality. And they mean this. This isn't some just paying lip service to a problem. And they've successfully overcome challenges in curbing excess capacity. They're upgrading their infrastructure, industrial infrastructure, should I say. And in 2013, they created around 50 million new urban jobs, for people residing in cities. And the registered unemployment rate in Chinese cities is around 4%. They say they want to keep it below 5%, but they want to keep dropping it. They are working on this all the time, and the West just goes, well, China's economy is going to crash because, they've been this huge export market for years, since the late 90s. And they're doing, well, no, they're actually rotating their economy. And do you know what? They're keeping their growth at over 6%. Now, if Western nations had 6% growth, I mean, we would be just dancing in the streets for the next 50 years on the fact we had the economic growth of that strength. They're doing all this while rotating their economy in a hugely fundamental way. And they're doing it very, very successfully. But as you say, everybody thinks what China's doing, is ridiculous. And, I did a huge article on one of the podcasts, and obviously I'm not going to go into detail because, people pay for that. But I talked about the capital outflows, and the gist of it is it's absolute nonsense. Yeah. It's not happening the way people are. And one thing I can say in very broad terms is people are going, well, there's been this huge dumping of foreign exchange reserves. They had 4 billion. It's now, 3.3 billion. Well,
good.
I hate to upset people. Yeah, exactly. I hate to upset people, but they could go to 2 billion and less, and it wouldn't bother them one iota. But the world's foaming at the mouth. Well, and as I pointed out in the podcast, the simple reality is, why would you want to keep hold of all these currencies when you know they're worthless?
Yeah.
So you dump them and buy assets, but no, there's capital outflows, and somehow the Chinese economy is cratering. Well, if their economy is cratering, I don't know what we can say about Western economies. I mean, there's no adjective that's comparable in that regard. But yes, and still there's this. I mean, I understand the average person in the street's not going to know about this. Well, that's fine. But all these economists and analysts are just buried their head in the sand, and they're just living in the old paradigm that says nothing's going to change. And we mentioned before we came on air, and I think we have to mention Draghi. His comment, which came out just before we started, is an absolute classic. He said, both corporate bond spreads and equity prices, meaning stock prices, appear to be broadly in line with fundamentals. And my answer is, what fundamentals in a parallel universe? I mean, these are the kind of people who just have no grasp on reality. And the platitudes they come out with, the words that they're just empty words backed by nothing. They just can't say the same things every month, and the market basically does nothing. It might move around a bit. The algos probably scratch their head and aren't quite sure what to do. But this is the kind of level of insanity that we have to deal with in the West. And then you've got what's going on in the East, and Russia's very much the same. They've rotated their economy. We've talked about that previously. These are massive changes that are happening globally. And of course, what's Trump realizing? I'm going to have to do exactly the same. We're going to have to make some painful decisions. We're going to have to do some things that aren't going to be popular. But in order to rebuild the US economically, politically and socially, it's going to take a monumental effort. Why? Because it's a nation of, 4 million square miles, you might as well say, 340 million people. I mean, in essence, the US is 50 countries. It's not kind of, I mean, people in the UK go, "What? How do you mean? I don't understand." And then you explain, obviously, how it operates. But there's huge challenges ahead. But without him, there would be no chance. But I mean, we'll have to see what he does. But if he can make some monumental strides in the first 12 months, and I think how he intends financing it is going to surprise people. And I'm aware of some things which I'm not going to talk about because could be deeply damaging to do so. But I think he may be able to pull some great rabbits out of the hat in terms of how he intends to refinance the massive infrastructure build that's required. And people are saying, well, he's already talking about increasing the size of the military. Well, in some aspects, yes, but also they're going to pull back, as we've said before, in terms of bases across the world. That's going to be a huge change. So they're going to slash the budget in that regard. But there are other ways where he's going to be very inventive, because that's what he is. He's a businessman, and he goes, I need to do this. And he's going to drive a hard bargain and get the best deal he can for the US in regards of how they rebuild all the infrastructure, how they then sign trade deals. But he's going to do it in a way that both parties, whether it's Russia and the US, or the UK and the US, they're all going to sit there and go, this works for both of us. We're really happy with this. This is working out fine, and that's exactly what he's going to do. But he's not going to do it like a politician. So there's going to be a lot of getting used to for all of us in terms of how he conducts himself. I mean, he conducts himself how we'd like a president to do and how a government would operate. But it's interesting to see how it actually works in the real world. And it's not a question of him and we've seen with the immigration ban, whether you people like it or not, the loopholes he's having to jump through to make this happen. It's not a question of a president just saying, this is what I'm going to do. I give it maybe a year or two, and that will start to calm down as people within inside the administration who are thwarting him and people outside who are thwarting him, they will start to receive more and more, and it will make life a lot easier. But he's up against a huge brick wall, and or the swamp as it's been referred to, and he's going to have to work very, very hard to negotiate how you get over the wall, or you drain the swamp, or whatever else he's got to do, and that's going to be a massive challenge.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the work is absolutely daunting. And here we are, week 3. And from all the news reports is that the staffers are typical White House staffers. They are absolutely tired. They cannot believe the pace of the pace that which this man moves. It's truly remarkable. And also, Paul, real quick on the London thing. I don't know if you heard about what the LBMA is going to be doing. They want more. They're going to go for more transparency. Isn't that funny?
Well, they're going to have to, because here the reality is they now know what's coming. They've seen that the East has got everything's, the Shanghai Gold Exchange, it's all physically backed. If you or I buy an ounce of gold from there, it's backed by an ounce of gold. They're going to look at the gold market. They're seeing the amount. I mean, 154 tons of gold went east from it's the usual policy via London through Switzerland refiners east to China. About 40 tons went to Hong Kong. Now, this is a huge escalation, and they're seeing all the physical metal going east, and they're going, well, if we're going to have a future, rather like the comics, we're going to have to start to become more orientated the way the East is. If they don't, they're going to die.
Yeah.
And I think the realization, they know they're going to die now. So, because, I mean, there's the whole argument. They'll say, yeah, well, we have, our gold, if you buy an ounce of gold, it's backed by gold. Well, show us the reserves. Where are they? Prove it. And rather like the US in terms of Fort Knox and the 8,000 tons that doesn't exist. I mean, it's the same principle. So they're going to have to prove their worth, otherwise they will die. And what's going to replace it? Well, the Chinese will be the dominant force, but also Dubai seems to be accelerating in terms of what's going on in there as a gold exchange. So it's kind of interesting what's happening east, but the West is going to have to modify and resolve its fundamental flaws. And that's the same with any aspect of the financial system. I mean, it's like NATO is another example. NATO now realizes it's going to have to evolve or die. I mean, when Trump said it was obsolete, people went, what do you mean he's going to raise it to the ground? No, it needs massive reform. The reform is it becomes a defensive rather than offensive, but it has to be offensive sometimes. But it's all about combating terrorism and cybercrime, particularly. They are the two big major problems in the future. If we're going to have this paradigm where everyone grows up and stops deciding they have to bomb each other for no reason, which is exactly where we're going to go. So it's a modernization like the IMF. The IMF is it can have a function in the future, but if it doesn't mend its ways and change its attitude, and we're seeing some insanity coming out regarding Greece, and not just Greece, other nations, they don't evolve, they will die as well, because there's the East has got a ready-made replacements in now, people in line, and people say, well, I'm not very happy about that from a Western perspective. Well, that's their problem. They're going to have to make those changes, or for a period of time, they're going to be left out in the dark, and they're going to have to rely on the Chinese for a lot of things they don't want to. But I mean, I did something in the podcast where we talked about a lot about Japan. Now people see Japan and China as these big sworn enemies. Well, actually, they're working very hard together in terms of payments using SIPs, which is obviously the Chinese interbank. Well, it's the cross-border interbank payment system, but to avoid confusion, it's to do with China. That's one aspect. There's a lot of things going on that people aren't aware of, and these are supposed to be sworn enemies. But no, they're working very hard. Why? Because Japan realizes it makes far more sense to use that than SWIFT.
Yeah, so, absolutely. And the fact that China is Japan's biggest trading partner.
Absolutely. And then the question comes in, well, what's going to happen with SWIFT in the future? Well, it will have to evolve because it won't be as competitive as SIP.
Yeah.
And therefore, it will change, but this isn't going to happen overnight. And then people fret, well, we've still got all these establishments, the cabal's still in charge. It isn't. It just because the IMF exists, just because the Federal Reserve exists, doesn't matter. It makes no difference. These institutions can exist if they're working for the betterment of the US in terms of the Federal Reserve, the IMF globally, and doing the job they should have always done. There isn't a problem. But if they're not, the wrecking ball is going to take them down, and that's where it comes in with the idea of leveling the playing field and flattening the cabal in the process. That will absolutely happen. But I think we have to be a little bit careful. The idea, as we said, that somehow Trump or anyone else is going to wreck the financial system, because the Chinese could have done it in 2008. The Russians were really keen for them to do it until the Chinese pointed out, well, yeah, we'll do it, and then what? Oh, well, hang on a minute. We've got nothing to replace it. We're going to be in big trouble. So, of course, it never happened. And people kept going, well, the Chinese are cabal because they could sink the US easily. Well, why would it be in the Chinese interest to sink the US? It is in no one's interest to sink the US, much as it's in no one's interest to sink China. In a logical, sane world, not a cabal world. And that's exactly how they're thinking. And we need to get away from this idea it's all about the cabal, and the cabal are still running the show and nothing's changing. There's massive changes, and it's what I call the Berlin Wall moment. The Berlin Wall didn't come down because one day someone said, chop it down. It came about because 100 things were happening that no one was aware of until it became too obvious. And then the wall came down, although it came down too early, which is kind of an interesting story, that it was supposed to come down a few days later, and these military guys at the wall got an order, or something got mixed up, and the wall was allowed to come down a few days earlier than it should have been. But that's the kind of scenario we're looking at in terms of what's going to happen. It's kind of a Berlin Wall moment, when the realization is, yes, it's all massively changing, but week on week we see what Trump's doing and how the rest of the world reacts to that, and what the rest of the world's doing. And we can't be too focused on what the US is doing. Particularly, there's huge things going on globally, but it's all interrelated, and that's what I try to do, and others try to do, is look at the whole big picture and understand how all these pieces hang together. So why is the US behaving the way it is with Iran, for example? Or why is the US now backtracking in terms of its attitude to Israel? And what are the political ramifications for them backtracking in terms of its policy in Raqqa? These are all important things we need to assess, because people say, well, that doesn't matter to me in terms of the US. Well, it does, because the US isn't an island. It can't just, as much as he wants to have protectionism, and to a degree, or sensible protectionism, the US is going to have to operate like every other nation in the world. So it is important it does the right things in the Middle East, and its foreign policy, if it does the right things, the rest of the world will embrace the US. That's massively beneficial for them. If they start upsetting the rest of the world in the process, it could cause huge damage to the US internally. no
Yeah,
matter what it's. And that's the thing people need to be aware of, that is the huge ramifications of what's going on.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, Paul. And another thing, I mean, you touched base on that. A lot of people still point out to these obsolete leftover systems. Oh, the Federal Reserve's still up. Oh, the market rigging and all these other things are going on. Oh, the EC. These systems have all been circumvented, folks, and that's what people need to understand. The systems that are in place right now, the Federal Reserve, the New York Stock Exchange, the London Stock Exchange, all the central banks on the West, they've all been circumvented. These are done. These are all been obsoleted, and the time is coming when the plug will be pulled on all of them.
No, absolutely, but it's one of those things. It frustrates people because they, I mean, the great one that people. It's the one thing I always get from people is, well, I'm still seeing chemtrails, nothing's changing. I mean, do they really imagine that that's top priority? Yes, it's an issue, and then there's the question, what exactly are chemtrails? And that's a whole separate matter in itself. But the question is, why is that so important? Why is 9/11 so important? No, get the fundamental building blocks of your nation back on track, and the rest of those things will take care of themselves. But the ideology that we chip away at something that really annoys us on an individual basis is not the answer. It goes about it the completely wrong way. Trump has a plan. I think rather like the Chinese, he has a long-term plan. He's rolling it out. He knows what he's doing. He's not going to be popular always, and some of his own supporters are going to turn around at times and go, well, why did he do this? But you have to judge him in 2 or 3 or 4 years' time, and if he fulfills what he says he wants to do, and I have confidence at this stage he's capable of doing that, then the US will be transformed into a nation. And in 4 years' time, even his most ardent critics will have to grudgingly say, well, do you know what? He's done quite a good job. I don't like the guy. I don't like some of the things he stands for, but he's transformed the US into a strong nation amongst equals. And if he does that, then he will be written in the history books as in terms that no other US president has ever been talked about.
Let me ask you a question, Paul. What do you think the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers? Because people always get emails. Trump is connected to them, and they're still in power. Blah blah blah. And I keep trying to remind people it's a different ball game now. What's your take on that?
Well, absolutely. I mean, just because he's filmed with or photographed with the Rockefellers or with the Rothschilds, it doesn't mean he's a Rockefeller or a Rothschild stooge. He knows how to play the game. He wouldn't have become the US president if he'd come out all guns blazing and attacking the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers. He would never got past first base. He played the game. He played the game to get the Republican nomination. He played the game to get elected.
Yeah.
He got elected, and he will deliver what he's promised, but he'll deliver lots of other things in the process. And it's a game. He knows how to play it. People look at things in very black and white terms as though, well, Kissinger met Putin's cabal. No, Kissinger went with a begging bowl, begging that he didn't throw the cabal to the lions, and he told him to go away.
Yeah.
And that's the reality. But people look at things in isolation.
And if you notice, right after Kissinger went before Vlad to beg for his life, he went then he went and met with Trump because they knew they couldn't stop the man.
Exactly, and that's the thing. But people see everything in this very black and white way. Oh, well, this means this. The world, if you're going to defeat the cabal, you don't defeat the cabal by playing a straight hand with them. Right. You have to be devious, you have to be clever, you have to be smart, you have to be intuitive. Otherwise, they would have crushed him out of existence. He knew he's playing a very dangerous game. I mean, when he first stood in terms of a nomination, that was probably the most dangerous time he has. Now, I mean, from my perspective, everyone said it was about Clinton getting elected. I think it was about Jeb Bush getting elected, but of course he failed. Right.
Yeah,
he failed miserably. He didn't. He was just a non-event from day one. Then, of course, that was a huge problem because they had to switch allegiance to Clinton. And, of course, ultimately that failed as well. But no, Trump plays a very clever game. And it's the same across the world. Just because Xi Jinping is talking to so-and-so or one of his deputies is having a a business lunch with some Western cabal types doesn't mean they're cooking some grand scheme to throw a curveball into proceedings and allow the cabal to win. That's not how that's not how the world works. It's very, very different. And if Trump hadn't done what he'd done, he would have never succeeded. So at times he will have had to have shook people's hands that made his skin crawl.
Right.
But that's how you do business. That's how it's going to work. And he's going to do that going forward. There's going to be people he's going to have to talk to that he'd rather not even look at, never mind talk to them. But that's how he's going to have to behave and operate to succeed. And eventually, the obstacles will become less and less, and his progress will get smoother and smoother. But it's not going to be something that happens overnight. And it wasn't like some people said to me, "Oh, well, now Trump's elected, it's over for the cabal, and we can, in a couple of weeks, we'll all be, kicking back and watching the party happen." Well, no, absolutely not. It's but just because he's not done things in 2 weeks the way they think, and it's also, the Keystone Pipeline's a great example. Well, he's not doing anything from the environment. It's not going to change anything. Well, yes, he rerouted the pipeline. Yes, ultimately, yes, gas and oil will become irrelevant. Free energy technology, in whatever form that might be, will come to pass. But it's not going to happen this year. It's not going to happen next week. You get these people out there who'll tell you all this. It's nonsense. It will eventually happen. But you have to transition the economy to handle the fallout of doing that. Rather like China's done. China spent years transitioning its economy so it can move from the old world to the new world. They didn't just do it overnight, because if they tried to do it overnight, they would have wrecked their entire economy and crashed it. It's the same process with gas and the hydrocarbon industry. You can't just phase it out and expect the world to function and operate. I mean, what are we going to do? Trump's going to go, well, I'm going to roll out all this free energy technology, and the rest of the world goes, hang on a minute. You've just wrecked and destroyed our entire economy. They're not going to take that lying down. Never mind what it'll do to the US economy, because how do you roll that out to 130 or whatever million households that exist in the US? It's a huge job. So these things people need to think about the consequences. If you think, well, why don't they do this? Just think about what that actually means in reality, and it's very, very different.
Absolutely correct, man. Absolutely correct. Paul, we're at the end of the broadcast. Why don't you plug your site, your services, the premium services that you offer, and how people can follow you, your social media?
Well, thank you very much. Okay, well, obviously we have the website, which is thesiriusreport.com. That's SIRIUS. There's a lot of sections. We put free articles on there from time to time. We do a news update, which takes some of the stuff we don't cover in the podcast, but we think are interesting news items, and that's in the news update section. We have the premium content, as you very kindly plug for us on a regular basis, and that's an in-depth analysis of daily events. We bring them out 5 days a week. It's geopolitical, financial intel. I mean, the stuff we're talking about today scratches at the surface. We give a lot more detail on the podcast. We go to the really nitty-gritty, as I say. And that's obviously costs $4.75 a month. So you get about 22 podcasts. They're about 10 to 15 minutes each. Obviously, we have the new YouTube channel called London Paul, which we're going to put out occasional podcasts, which we think will help, get people interested in subscribing to us. But also what we're going to do going forward, and in a very high level way, we're going to tell people every week on that, so it's free, so people can understand what we do on the podcast. Well, This week we talked about this and we discussed this in detail, and we'll cover in very high level, not the details, so people then understand what they get with the podcast. Because I think at the moment some people are a bit confused as to, well, what are you telling me in the podcast? Why should I spend $4.75 a month? So we thought that was a very good idea. Obviously, we have the Twitter page at the Sirius Report, and I guess that's essentially what we do. And we thank you very much for having us on each week. It's a real pleasure to be here, and it's great to work with you both. and Rogue Money as a whole.
Absolutely, we're proud to have you. We're excited and honored to have you on, Paul. I mean, guys, you want some really great intel. You want to have the pulse. Forget the rhetoric, forget the hubris, forget the nonsense and the myopic views that are out there. If you want a broad understanding of geopolitical, geoeconomic, geostrategic events, there is no better place than that premium service from thesiriusreport.com. Go there, subscribe. We at Rogue Money definitely recommend it. You know, we love the work that London Paul has been doing. This guy is an insider of insiders. Check it out. You won't be disappointed. I promise you that. You will really think to yourself, wow. And then, you know, I've gotten emails from people who've benefited and said, hey, you know what? The advice that, you know, Paul's been giving us, it gave us some real insights on what we need to do with some of the investments that we had overseas. You know, people have emailed me saying, you know, I've never saw the world in what regards of what's happening in Europe and what's happening in the East until I started listening to these podcasts. So these are the types of reviews that we've been getting from the Sirius Reports premium podcasting service. You need to check it out. And for the price that's less than a venti latte, frappuccino, macchiato, whatever from Starbucks, you can get yourself a real geopolitical education. That's all I have to say about that, Paul.
Well, thank you. That's, you know, I couldn't say it better myself. So thank you very much. We appreciate all your support, and you've been very, very helpful in that regard. And we, you know, we really do appreciate that. And so thank you very much.
Absolutely. Folks, thank you again. And we'll be here next week on another Sirius Report with London Paul. So tune in again next Monday. Be here or be square. CJ, take it away, buddy.